Indefensible, 7 myths that sustain the global arms trade, which is a very good book for learning how to counter-argue all these myths that we are facing in the debate here today. With us we have 3 very distinguished experts on the global arms trade to help us to do just that. Let me present the panel. I'll start with Mr. Andrew Feinstein, who's the author of the book that the film was based on, which we just saw, The Shadow World. I don't know if we have a copy of that here tonight. And he's also co-author of this book that we are launching here tonight, Indefensible, 7 Myths That Sustain the Global Arms Trade. You're a former member of the Parliament of the ANC in South Africa. You're Executive Director and founder of Corruption Watch, based in London. We also have Dr. Samuel Perlo-Freeman with us here today. He's researcher, project manager for the World Peace Foundation, and you head a project on the global arms trade and corruption, I've been told. You're also former head of the CIPRI's Military Expenditure Project, and you're also co-author of this book that we are launching here tonight. Last but not least, we have Ms. Linda Åkerström, who's head of the disarmament at the Swedish Peace and Arbitration Society. Linda is also author of the book Den svenska vapenexporten, the Swedish export of arms, which we also have here today. I'm going to kick off the discussion. There's a challenge with time here, but I would also like to invite the audience at the end of the discussion to pose some questions to our panelists here tonight. So please keep your questions in mind. But I would like to kick off the discussion by asking Mr. Feinstein. You've written the book that the film we just saw is based on, Shadow World. Could you elaborate a bit on why you've engaged in this topic, sure, why you've written the book, the background to the book and the film, and your engagements?
First of all, just thank you very much to Svenska Freds and Diakonia for organising and hosting this evening's event. It's great to be able to come to a place where people take an interest in these issues. And the fact that we're talking about 3 books tonight, one published primarily in the UK, one in the US, and one in Sweden, all of them available all over the world, is really important. Because the reason that I work on this issue is I was an ANC Member of Parliament in South Africa, as you mentioned, and 4 years into our democracy, after our first democratic elections in 1994, the ANC government, my own government, decided to spend $10 billion on weapons that the country didn't need and that we've barely used to date. So, for instance, we bought 24 Jazz Gripen jet fighters. Half of them have never left the ground because South Africa can't afford to train the pilots to fly them. We can't afford to fuel them in the air, and we have absolutely no need of them because we have no enemies. $300 million of bribes were paid on those deals, including by the consortium of Saab and BAE Systems, who paid an amount of what is now probably about 140 million euros to win their one contract, which they should never have won. They didn't make an initial shortlist. So the defense minister, who received a massive bribe from Saab, decided to exclude cost as a decision-making criteria in the most expensive contract that the democratic South Africa has signed to this day. And this was at a time when our then President Thabo Mbeki said we didn't have enough money to provide antiretroviral medication for almost 6 million South Africans living with HIV or AIDS. And the School of Public Health at the Kennedy School at Harvard conservatively estimated that that resulted in 365,000 avoidable deaths over the next 5 years, with 52,000 babies born HIV positive every year in those 5 years. But not only that, it also destroyed our democracy. It was the point at which the ANC, a party I joined in my teens, lost its moral compass. So that today South Africa sits with a President, Jacob Zuma, who faced 783 counts of fraud, corruption and racketeering in relation to that deal. The charges were dropped very controversially by a prosecutor 3 weeks before he was elected president. The prosecutor was made a High Court judge 3 weeks after he was elected president. And unfortunately, that's the way governance in South Africa has gone ever since. And Saab and BAE and 2 German companies, an Italian company and a French company, are directly responsible for that implosion of South Africa's nascent democracy. But the most terrifying thing was that when I started, my first book was just on that deal and its impact on South Africa's democracy. And I thought, were we particularly stupid? Were we particularly naive and gullible? And I soon found out not at all, that this was happening all over the world all the time. And that's what really motivated the research and the writing of The Shadow World, and then the making of the film, because this is an issue that I think needs to be at the forefront of political debate all over the world, and instead is on the periphery. And it reflects so much that is wrong with our politics globally. And that's why myself and my colleagues devote our time to working on this particular subject.
Thank you. And thank you for raising the case of South Africa. And of course, being in Sweden, I was going to ask you about that. One of the myths in the book is myth number 5, that corruption in the arms trade is only a problem in developing countries. But the deal that you mentioned demonstrates very clearly that this is not the case. I mean, we experienced how Sweden engaged heavily to try to persuade South African government to buy the Åkerström fighter jets. And as you said, I mean, the deal went through and it was revealed later that there was massive corruption. And if I understood correctly, the BAE Systems had to pay a huge criminal fine for this deal as well. But this myth, I mean, it looks like corruption is part and parcel of the global arms trade deal from what we saw from the film. Is that true?
Well, a researcher called Joe Rober, who was working at Transparency International at the time, calculated that it accounts for around 40% of all corruption in global trade. When the US Department of Commerce decided to do a study on 5 years of corrupt transactions by US companies, 53% of those transactions were in the defense sector. So it is massive. And, you know, we talk about, yes, South Africa was corrupted. We talk about corruption in many countries of the global south. But where does that corruption come from? It comes from right here. You know, BAE Systems paid, on just one deal with Saudi Arabia, £6 billion in bribes. And the investigation into that particular deal was stopped by Tony Blair when he was Prime Minister. Your Prime Minister in this country, who at the time was a trade unionist heading the International Relations Department of the Metal Workers Union in this country, effectively bribed the South African Metal Workers Union with a bribe of 5 million rand because they were in political alliance with the ANC to help persuade the ANC leadership to go with the Saab BAE option on the South African deal, and he is now your country's Prime Minister.
Oh, we were told he was just financing a wonderful new school there.
Yeah.
Can I just follow up on that and the role of governments? I mean, here in Sweden and the UK, we've often heard that the corruption has nothing to do with us, and the government say that. It's the middlemen, contracted by the companies. Our hands are clean. I mean, is this true?
Well, the way in which they do it, to give you the example of BAE, who were the strategic marketing partner of Saab for many, many years on the Jazz Gripen plane, BAE effectively created perhaps the most extensive network of the payment of bribes and the laundering of that money that has ever been seen. Which is why they paid bribes on the scale that they did and why Saab wanted to be in partnership with them. And yes, they claim it's all through the intermediaries, the middlemen. They quite consciously utilize these middlemen to distance themselves legally from the payment of the bribes, to make it slightly more difficult for the legal consequences to come back to them. But unfortunately, they needn't really worry, because the vast majority of the players in this trade operate with virtual impunity. To give you just one example, on 6 deals, so the £6 billion of bribes, the deal, that one they didn't pay anything because the investigation was stopped. On 6 other deals, including the South African deal and 5 others, they paid a fine of, if I remember correctly, £500,000. And they had to pay a penalty of £21 million to the government of Tanzania, which was one of the governments they'd corrupted in the deal. And that becomes just a cost of doing business. So it's as though these companies, which are very closely linked to the state in all its forms, to political parties and individual politicians, can do what they want, knowing that they'll get away with it. And because this whole industry takes place behind a veil of national security imposed secrecy, most of the time they do get away with it. One more fact, because we forget, of course, that these weapons have deadly consequences. So of the 502 violations of UN arms embargoes that we identified in the shadow war, so that's only up until mid-2011, 502 violations. 2 had resulted in any legal consequences. 1 in a conviction in which an intermediary, an arms dealer, paid a fine that was small change to him. So that's the nature of the global arms trade.
We can come back to that. Just to move on to the book and to Mr. Perlo-Freeman, one of the myths explained in the book is that the defence industry is a key contributor to national economies. And I mean, being in Sweden, one of the top exporters in terms of capita when it comes to value, those who defend this export here in our country, they often claim that the arms business is very important for the Swedish economy and for jobs. Is this true? Is it a myth? If so, why has it gained such prominence in the debate?
Well, the arms industry and arms trade will often concentrate a lot of jobs in one place, somewhere like Trollhättan. And one deal, a big arms deal with Brazil or South Africa or wherever, you can get a great big headline figure. This deal will protect 5,000 jobs or however many it is. So it can be very headline grabbing, and conversely, if a big arms company runs into trouble, then it may be one particular town, like Trollhättan, will be very badly affected. It will be a lot of jobs lost in one place. But actually, compared to the economy as a whole, it's really pretty tiny. I would estimate that the Swedish arms industry, Swedish arms production sustains at most about 20,000 jobs. That's a very rough estimate, but it's the sort of ballpark. So compared even to Swedish manufacturing industry, it's very small. I think in the UK, where it's sort of blown up above all other industries as the great example of British success, certainly in manufacturing, it's maybe 1% of GDP, 0.5% of employment. Governments will trumpet it as something of absolutely crucial importance, but it's really a tiny share of the economy. Moreover, in terms of the number of jobs it creates for the money that goes into it, whether that's from the domestic government or from foreign governments in terms of exports, it tends to create far fewer jobs per million crowns or million pounds than other areas of government spending. For example, health and education. Now, $1 billion invested in education, it won't create the big headlines of 5,000 jobs in this one place. It's lots of schools creating a small number of jobs across the country. But for the same amount of money, you'll be getting a lot more jobs out of it. At the same time, it is taking away some of the most important science and engineering talent away from the more important, the more innovative civilian areas of manufacturing, of research and development, of industry. Because another aspect of this myth is that the arms industry is the key to innovation. It's the key to industrial development, that you get all these spin-offs, the internet, which is partly true that it was developed by the military, but even that's not 100% true. But nowadays, the real innovation comes in civil information communications technology. And military technology rides on the back of that. It uses the civilian technology, though a few years old, into its military technology, and then takes it off in a dead end, which is useful for nothing else except for producing arms.
So what you're saying is the other way around.
Exactly, it's spinning from the civilian to the military sector. It used to be that the traffic would go in both directions, but now, overwhelmingly, it's in that direction from civil to military. So actually, when governments invest so much in military research and development, it's rather less in Sweden as a share of GDP than in, say, Britain or the United States, but it's still significant, then it's actually diverting resources away from the areas which will actually produce innovation and develop an economy. And yet this idea is still incredibly widely believed, that developing countries, middle-income countries like Brazil or Thailand or Indonesia will convince themselves that developing their arms industry is the key to industrial transformation. It is not. It's an industrial dead end. And if you actually look at some of the developing countries that have succeeded in developing an effective arms industry, like South Korea, it's because they already had a very strong civilian industrial base on which the arms industry could piggyback.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. I was going to ask you about the technological innovation. I'm glad you raised that, because that's also an argument we hear a lot here in Sweden. Moving on to Sweden, Ms. Åkerström, you've written a book about the Swedish export of arms, and you followed this for quite some time now. And I have to look at my papers here. I mean, according to the Swedish current regulation, the export of arms should not be granted if there are severe and extensive human rights abuses in the recipient country, nor if the country is involved in armed conflict. Still, we see a huge list of countries where we see gross violations of human rights going on that are on the recipient list of Swedish export of arms. How can this be? What's wrong here? Is the policy wrong, or is it about the implementation? Why are we where we are today?
Well, the key here is it should not be exported, but it's not forbidden to do so. So it looks kind of restrictive on paper. You should not do this, but you're still allowed to do so if it's considered important enough for security or defense reasons. So there are loopholes. There are possibilities of still exporting if it's considered important enough, and it's considered important enough. Let's say so, because it's continuously making these kind of exceptions.
So there are loopholes. I mean, what kind of loopholes? How does it slip through, so to speak?
It's the whole licensing procedure weighs values against each other. So you have the security and defense reasons here, and then you have human rights and preventing armed conflict and supporting developing nations, etc. And then these values are weighed against each other in the government authority making these kind of licensing processes. And since this is done in secrecy, we don't really know how this kind of weighing process is done. But we know the output of the process, and it's like these kind of deals that should not be granted are granted again and again. And the figures for last year came yesterday. And we see recipient states as United Arab Emirates, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Oman, etc. Lots of these kind of countries that we know that there is strong support in the Swedish public and in the Swedish parliament for not exporting to. So I think the regulation is designed in this way because the people in charge wants to have these kind of loopholes. So it's not an accident.
Thank you. We're talking about myths here that sustain the global arms trade. Are there any specific myths that characterises the Swedish situation? We talked about jobs and corruption, and what would you raise?
When I read the book is really great. I truly recommend it. It's a very good tool for anyone who's in this kind of debate and trying to find facts and support the arguments against. And especially since the people on our side trying to criticize the exports, we are often described as kind of emotional, whilst the other side, they are the rational, objective people. But in fact, as this book shows, I think it's a lot of the rational arguments are really based on other things, perhaps like tradition, identity, and that kind of soft emotional arguments. But back to the question, all of the myths apply to Sweden, but I think the myth that is perhaps more historically important in Sweden is the one that has to do with independence. In Sweden, we believe that arms industry and arms trade makes us independent. And it wasn't true before when we had a neutrality policy, because a trade that's based on creating relationships with other countries, binding the countries together for decades sometimes, and some of them authoritarian regimes that can never make you independent. But in this world, the industry is internationally owned. The material in themselves is also international. So JAS Gripen, perhaps the most Swedish of arms systems, is more than 50% international. It wouldn't be able to be produced in Sweden without support. So this is a myth, I think, it's very recurring that needs to be countered.
Could you tell us a bit about the process right now? We're in an interesting situation now in Sweden as we are reviewing the Swedish arms regulations. Why is this taking place right now? What's the background? And what can we expect coming out of this? And what are the prospects for getting better policies in place, would you say? What can we hope for?
Well, the process has been going on for, I think, Svenska Freds raised this issue the first time in the 1990s or something like that. So
it's a long due process.
Yeah, it's very long. But after the Arab Spring, it was realized in the debate that Sweden had armed every second regime in the Middle East and North Africa region. So we were quite literally on the wrong side of where we wanted to be. And that's when the whole process started on reviewing the guidelines to see if we could actually sharpen the guidelines to non-democratic countries. And then after that, this procedure has been just lagging and dragging on. And now, 6 years later, we are actually seeing discussions in the government on the wordings of how big should the loopholes be, should there be any, and why, etc. So this is when this procedure is actually going to come to some kind of final end.
What's the next steps? I mean, there is a decision to be made this year.
The government proposition or suggestion. What is the name to the parliament?
Bill.
Proposal.
Yeah, the bill.
The bill. That's it. Parliamentarians in the room. It's good. The bill is supposed to be handed over to the parliament this spring. We're told somewhere between mid-May and mid-June, and then it's going to the parliament in the beginning of the autumn, we think. And this is truly really important issue. This is going to decide who will receive Swedish arms for decades and decades to come, probably.
And the prospects for getting a better policy in place than the one we have.
It all depends on the government. I'd say how the majority of parliament belongs to political parties that actually have decisions already taken on not exporting to dictatorships. So if they would follow their own decisions, then we should have had this decision a long time ago. But if they chose to disregard their own decisions and choose the loophole way, then yeah.
So it's all up for grabs still. The debate is ongoing. I'm going to let the audience pose some questions. Do I have any volunteers or any hands in there of asking questions to our panelists? I'm sure there are experts in the room, so any question that you'd like to... Yes, I have one hand. Maybe we should use the mic. Is it possible to... Okay, we'll try.
I have a question for Linda.
Could you please just introduce yourself?
Gabriella from Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. So the numbers that you raised were released yesterday, and there's a raise of 45% of Swedish arms sale for 2016. And my first thought was, is this because of the process that's going on, and that they see that maybe it's going to be harder, and therefore they speeded up the arms sale for 2016, or since the process started?
I think it has to do with the overall trend of lots of more conflicts and lots of more arms sales recently. So we released figures on that recently. So it's like a good market for arms right now, and also with Swedish companies. But yeah, there's we see the risks that the Swedish companies are actually going on a PR spree to try to sell a lot of arms right now, also to countries that should be stopped with this kind of new regulation. For example, Philippines. Saab has been in the Philippines to try to market arms recently, and so that's not really hopeful for us. And there are great risks that deals are actually made now, and that they would fall under the current regulation, and that they would not be subjected to the regulations or the more strict regulations that we are hoping to be in place soon.
Two more questions, yeah, please. Lady Gray.
My name is Karin Olofsson, and I'm leading an organization called Parliamentary Forum on Small Arms and Light Weapons Issues. Very interesting, and congratulations to the books and the film, etc. I'm wondering also, as the question is primarily directed to you, Mr. Feinstein, also because as you are a former parliamentarian, and I'm thinking, as we are working as an organization, we are gathering parliamentarians across party political lines from all around the world to reduce and prevent armed violence with focus on small arms and light weapons, and focusing on the obstacle to development that it constitutes, and also link it up tightly to the Agenda 2030 and to the SDG 16.4 that is unique and historical because it recognizes the linkage between illicit flows of arms and sustainable development and peace building. So I would like to know, what do you think? Do you have specific reflections, observations, recommendations when you think about the parliamentary role? What would you find like especially important to focus on to address challenges based on the book?
I think where we are lucky enough to live in democracies, Parliament has an absolutely crucial role to play in ensuring that it conducts meaningful oversight of defense budgets, of arms exports, and I mean, parliamentarians are there, you know. President Mandela used to say to us, whenever he came to our parliamentary caucus meetings, which was most weeks, he would say to us, you know, as soon as you people, as in the MPs, think that you're important, then you can't do the service you're supposed to be doing. You've been elected here by the people of the country. You're just here to represent them. You're not here to represent yourself or to enhance yourself, be it financially or in some sort of ego-driven personal way. And as soon as you forget that your salaries, which are much higher than the average South African salary, are paid by ordinary South Africans, and you're here to do their bidding, you shouldn't be here anymore. And I think that that's exactly right, and I think that the role of parliamentarians is to hold the government to account on these sorts of issues. So because of the national security, national defense dimension of arms exports, of defense spending, an enormous amount of it is kept even from MPs. South African members of parliament never voted on our $10 billion arms deal. And that was actually unconstitutional in the South African context. And we should have been in a position to know that and to hold our own government to account. And that's what parliamentarians should be doing. So I think the building of coalitions of MPs from across party lines is an extremely important way to go. And I think that what you should do is, as I'm sure you know, there are various global organizations of MPs. I mean, I used to belong to an African group of MPs that was a subsidiary of a more global movement. Then there was a global organization of MPs against corruption. I think we should be starting a movement of members of parliament or public representatives for accountability in the arms trade, so that people could meet, they could help each other, because these are quite technical matters, they are quite complex matters, but they could actually help each other to hold their executives to account as a parliament. I do quite a lot of training of legislatures in the MENA region for that very purpose. And I go and I speak at these workshops and these conferences, and a lot of these MPs come from very, very troubled countries, and I get the impression some of them are just there for relief. They've got out of their own country for a few days and the problems of their own country. But then you always pick out the 2 or 3 people who take these issues incredibly seriously. And those are the people to work with. Those are the people to build their capacity. So to get them, if you had a group of Swedish MPs who were committed to holding the Swedish government to account, to work with MPs in Tunisia, in Iraq, wherever it is, to be able to do the same things with their governments. But of course that is only dealing with the countries where we have democracies of some sort and legislatures of some sort, although they're not always working that well. But I think the spreading of those skills, the solidarity, because it can be an incredibly lonely thing to do. When I decided to push ahead with the investigation of our arms deal, I was still in Parliament. And every day I would walk to my seat. About 200 of the 260 ANC MPs, as I walked, would all shout, "Traitor, traitor, traitor." So it's an incredibly lonely thing to do. And it often means you're going to end your political career, which I knew was the case. So I think for people to have support globally is incredibly important. And those are the sorts of directions that I think it would be worth looking at and moving towards.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question, coming from an MP.
Yeah,
Please
hello.
go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Carl Schlich, I'm an MP here, or MP, I used to be in the European Parliament, that's why I said the wrong word. But I so much recognize what you say. They don't shout traitor, but they look at you like you are one. I'm also investigating 2 arms deals now. And my question is a little bit, we are in a hurry. Yes, the proposal will be done in end of May, early June. But we are not going to manage to make the Green and the Social Democratic Party MPs go against their Prime Minister. So if we want to win this, we want to win this already before the government actually sends the proposal to the Parliament. It's very important. Both parties have party congress, the Social Democrats in April and the Greens in May. And it's the Swedish MPs actually have a lot of power on paper, but they are too afraid to use it, especially if your friends are in government.
Yeah.
So they are never going to use that. So it's important to use other politicians in these parties that you have confidence in from the local and regional level also. There might be a few MPs who would dare to take this fight, but we need a public debate. What the negotiators in our 2 parties want is silence. So they can peacefully negotiate, not creating problems with the cross-party deal that they made in the investigation before the proposal. They want silence, and they can make a small little tweak that sounds good that will change nothing in practice. That's the plan now. So if we want to win this battle, we must make it in public. We must drag out all these scandals. Debunk all these myths. Have your campaign that you're starting. We will never win this unless we have a public debate. That's my strongest message here. And I so much recognize what you have been describing in the movie and here today, and I'm so grateful. And as you said, you need friends even if they're outside the country, or even better when they are outside the country. And we need to talk, because I need some help from you actually about that.
Well, one thing I must say, sort of looking at Sweden and comparing with Britain, where I come from, is just how much more public debate on the arms trade there is, just how much more salient an issue it seems to be. That you know, you guys have been campaigning on these things over the decades or centuries, have been having an effect. Swedish arms export regulations, well, there's all sorts of problems with them, as you said. I think they are tighter than in most European countries, and the impact of that is actually to some extent felt, not as far as it should be, but that is because people in Sweden actually care about these issues, are actually willing to split their parties over these issues, which would be really unheard of in Britain, and that's because the voters of these parties actually care about these issues, and it's the sort of thing that they'll decide on. So, you know, the pressure that you're putting on, it's been having an effect over the decades, and it can continue to have an effect. And so yeah, I think that you guys are doing a really impressive job, and that pushing on can actually get results.
That's very encouraging to hear. Can I just throw into that? I have another question from the audience. Can I just throw into that? Are there any best cases? I mean, you said here in Sweden we have tighter regulations than most countries. Are we the best case? Or are there any best cases? Please tell me no.
I haven't found a country where I think the export regulations are incredibly well applied, where I think there are meaningful measures to combat the systemic corruption that characterizes the trade. I mean, the closest I've come is politicians avoid most of us like the plague. You know, they won't speak on platforms with us. The only case that I've had, I mean, in Holland at the moment they do, because they've suspended arms sales to Saudi Arabia because of Yemen, and so they were all wanting to speak on platforms with us when the film was on there for a few weeks. And even the head of the Arms Export Authority was willing to speak publicly to us. The only other place was in Norway a few years ago, where the then foreign minister, who'd been the defense minister, spoke on a platform with me, and he invited my tiny organization to come and investigate any arms deal we wanted to in Norway for signs of corruption. I think he probably knew at the time that 3 months later they were going to be out of government, which was the case. So we were never able to follow up on the invitation. But I do think seriously that an enormous amount has been done in this country. You know, I've worked for many years with Friedrich Loren, who has made some incredible documentaries on various arms deals by Saab. I've worked with Magnus at Diakonia, who's an old comrade when it comes to the South African struggle. And I think that we should seriously consider what we can do in the period between now and the decision being made here that could try and ensure that there is the outcome that we want. Swedish television were one of the first TV stations to buy the film. They've shown it a few times. I think we should go to them and propose a series of television debates around these issues, which is what the commissioning producer told me he wanted to do. And I think we should figure out ways of actually getting this as a widespread public debate over the next months in this country.
Yeah, sure. And I have two final questions from the
Can we
audience.
just say something about the process, and that it's actually looked upon internationally really, I get emails and phone calls from people asking about this process, and it's looked upon from activists all around the world to try to see what is Sweden doing, because the way Sweden is going to act is going to influence other countries, and if this decision is not taken, then it's also going to influence the decisions making in other countries. So it's really vital not only for Sweden but also for other countries. But just a quick note on us being the most robust. Let's not forget that most countries do not export arms at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Usually we're just comparing to a few other countries in Europe or United States or something like that, and it's like it's just not accurate. And Sweden is still the 11th largest arms exporter in the world, so it doesn't really say that much to be the most robust. If that's still the result.
Now you've woken up the panelists.
Very quickly, when I was researching the book, I interviewed the then political head of the Arms Export Authority here, and I challenged him about why they had simply ignored various of the EU Common Position articles in doing various deals, including the South African deal. And it was the most remarkable interview. Fortunately, there were representatives of various NGOs with me, because I thought I'd misheard in the interview. You know, first he'd say to me, oh, Article 8, no, that's too complex to understand, so we just ignore it. And then I said to him, so if a company is shown to have been engaged in corruption in a country that it's sold to, even if not by a Swedish court, does that in any way affect your decision on their next arms export, if it's a country that is vulnerable to corruption? He said, absolutely not. You know, those aren't Swedish systems of justice. We don't know what their justice system is like, so why should we take heed of it? And I honestly, I mean, I would have been terrified of quoting that, had those other witnesses who were Swedish not been in the room with me at the time.
No.
I have two questions for the audience. Lady at the back and also over here. I think we'll take both of them. Please, go ahead.
My name is Natasha and I'm working for an organisation called International IDA. So we deal with this question of politics and corruption and all that. My question is to you as a parliamentarian, former parliamentarian. There's this brilliant scene in the film, and the arms dealer says that all politicians are like prostitutes. And when you used to be kind of motivated by Mandela to do a public service, and essentially you're prostituting yourself in a way. So would you ever consider to go back into Parliament?
No. When I moved to the UK, I live in the UK now. I'm not in South Africa. I even find in South African elections there's no party that I feel comfortable voting for, which I find terribly sad.
And why not start a political
For a number of reasons, the main one being money. But also when I went to the UK, I was offered a sort of a route into British politics, because I had various connections in a British political party. And it did make me think about it. And also, especially when I'm in South Africa, people say to me, gee, don't you miss politics? Couldn't you make a bigger contribution as a politician? And two things strike me. The first is that I feel more engaged in politics doing this work outside of being an MP or in Parliament than I ever did as an MP. Because we have a constitutionally absurd system where twice every parliamentary year, because you're elected on a party list, the party leaders can just remove whoever they want from Parliament and put in the next people on the list. So you can't have an independent view. So that's why, for me, politics in South Africa was an obvious dead end, because they could literally just take me off their list. So the night before they were going to do that, I resigned, so that I could at least do it on my terms rather than they just kick me out of Parliament. And unfortunately, politics in quite a few countries, not all countries, has that sort of thing, where to have a political career for any length of time, you have to sort of pledge your allegiance to a party leader, and you effectively have to start thinking, stop thinking. But I really do believe that one can do far more on this sort of issue with a wide variety of organizations, including legislators, but as importantly, ordinary citizens. Because the bottom line of all of this is what Saab is doing, and remember when we talk about the economics, Saab is massively subsidized by the Swedish government. So what Saab and other defense companies here are doing is being done in your name with your tax money. And I think...
interrupt you? Sorry, we can go on the whole night. I'm just conscious of time. I just want to let in...
I'll answer your question.
Well.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Please speak up.
I can probably start. Sorry, I'm hiding here. My name is Perlo-Freeman. I'm a human rights lawyer, and I
I'm also the chairperson of the Swedish delegation for Agenda 2030, the SDGs. In my directive, it very clearly states that whatever we suggest to the Swedish government, it should be in such a manner that Sweden takes the prime role internationally in driving the SDGs and showing the path of how to drive the SDGs internationally. As a human rights lawyer, I very well know, not only based on what has been said today, I know that we have a long way to go. I was severely disappointed when the new asylum law was granted in our country, and already there, I, at a very personal level, realized that it will take a long time before Sweden can take a lead, which is part of the directive I have. But listening to you today and with your expertise, I believe that this work will be even more delayed if we do not show a zero tolerance towards this kind of business, towards dictatorship, and what it is doing, in fact, to human rights. So for the campaign which we are talking about today, I would humbly request all of you to please put a question to the government of Sweden. How do they see because it will help me also, maybe I'm acting more dumb than I actually am now. It will actually help me to see how probable and how possible it is for Sweden to take lead when it comes to the 17 goals, and at the same time being the 11th largest weapons exporter. So I just want to know, how is it compatible in my position? I know, and I hope you know too, that I'm acting a bit dumb now. But I think you should include that in your campaign, asking the Swedish government, because it's there, it's written black on white. We want to take lead internationally in this. How is that possible?
But I think, civil society in Sweden have constantly raised that policy incoherence.
Yeah.
How can it be that we have a feminist foreign policy and we're doing this, etc.?
Precisely. Another thing, if I may, we very often in Sweden we are very have a habit of thinking in silos. And I'm very happy, sir, that you mentioned that at the end of the day it's about citizens. It is about parliamentarians, it is about politicians, but it's also about informing our people about what is going on. I think many a times we assume, in Sweden at least, that our citizens are well informed and that they know. The thing is, they are not well informed. We are severely under-informed and slightly naive people, to be very honest. When it comes to the full, you talk about child rights. Aren't we the leading in the world? You talk about environment, ecology. Aren't we leading in the world? We talk about women's rights. Aren't we leading in the world? Well, are we that leading, really? That's the common idea of the common citizen. So if we talk about a public role when it comes to this, we must make an effort to reach out to the young ones, the first-time voters. We have an election in 2018.
I'm conscious we're running on overtime, but we were a bit delayed.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to lecture.
No, thank you for raising that. It's very important. And bearing that in mind and commenting on that, I want to pose two final questions to you as panelists. And if you have any other outstanding issues you feel you want to raise, please do so as well. But and I think we will touch upon this, but what key messages or recommendations would you like to put forward to the Swedish decision makers, not just the government, as they are now debating this issue here in Sweden? And secondly, and we'll touch upon this, what can we as citizens do to try to influence decision makers? And the campaign is one example, but what else? So please, maybe we should start with Mr. Perlo-Freeman.
Yeah, well, I think that Sweden has an opportunity to take a lead which would be almost unique amongst major arms exporters in saying absolutely no arms to dictatorships. you know, regardless of what the arms are, or case-by-case judgment of what they might be used for. An absolute no would be pretty much unique, and it's the sort of big, bold gesture that that sort of gets Sweden noticed on a whole lot of other things like feminist foreign policy, and which would be much more consistent with it than the current policy. Would it stop dictatorships getting arms? No, of course it wouldn't. You know, the argument, if we don't sell them, someone else will, in this case, is of course absolutely true. Sweden's pretty much a small player when it comes to selling to Saudi or UAE, but it takes someone to be the first to make that sort of stand. And the other thing, I think beyond this, the issue of really cracking down and having zero tolerance for corruption in arms exports is just so incredibly important when you're talking about meeting the sustainable development goals. I mean, as Andrew said, it sort of completely trashed South Africa's progress towards justice and development and good governance. That's not the thing that's on the agenda at the moment, but it's certainly something that can be thought of in the future. And I really don't see what Sweden is getting in return for being willing to sell arms to dictatorships. It's not a whole lot of money. And, you know, the idea that Sweden is getting more security by being able to produce Gripens rather than if we decide we need major fighter aircraft, buying them from somewhere else, what actual practical difference that makes. It's just an assumption that, like in so many countries that produce arms, it's so deeply ingrained. We wouldn't be us, we wouldn't have our status if we're not able to produce them ourselves. It's really a nonsense when it comes to the actual practical implications of it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Please.
I suppose what I'd ask you to consider is that a lot of the people to whom we're closing our borders are people fleeing from conflicts from which we are making money, from which our arms industry is making money. And so we're effectively, in moral and ethical terms, we're perpetrating the ultimate double whammy. We're contributing to the conflicts that are causing the massive dislocations of populations around the world, and then closing off our own countries to them. And I would simply say to everybody, you know, it's not about being a member of parliament, it's about each one of us is actually a politician. Each one of us is an activist. And I think you need to make clear before you vote for anybody, before you give anybody your support at any level of government, what your ethics and values as an individual are and what you would like your representatives to reflect. And on that basis, hopefully, develop policies that you feel, as a taxpayer and as a citizen, far more comfortable.
Thank you.
My job is kind of to make long lists of demands. I don't really know which one to choose.
You have 2 minutes.
In the short term, we need an absolute forbud. We need a really strong wording in the new regulation that says we cannot export any war material to non-democracies. End of discussion. Because what we see now is the fluffy languages that we've heard during the last years, they are trying to boil it down. And they are going to narrow the definition of what's included in this democracy criterion. They're going to try to narrow down the countries that can be affected by this policy. So what we need to do is to say that we do not any war material, not to any non-democracy, and try to get that wording as so strong that it cannot be changed in the coming decade or two.
And the current wording in the proposal, even the head of the Export Weapon Control Unit said it's not going to change.
Yeah. It's also about interpretation. So we need more openness, more transparency, so that we can actually look at the effect that these changes will have. And then, except for if we leave the government, I would say what we want people to do is to get organized. Because people sit in their own homes and they kind of get depressed and sad, and they watch stuff that Trump tweets and they get more depressed. And I'm one of them. But we need to like stop that individualist kind of depressing way of acting politically and start to organize together. We can do a lot of things. So yeah.
Thank you. And on that positive